Seeing our guests on the screen, I guess that I can begin. My name is Mark Nordenberg. I'm the former chancellor of the university and currently have the privilege of serving as chair of Pitt's Institute of Politics and director of its Dick Thornburg Forum for Law and Public Policy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's All Angles program, which is going to focus on issues of economic opportunity. All Angles is a new speaker and discussion program for students and is jointly sponsored by the Institute of Politics and the Office of the Chancellor. Its creation is the product of a number of forces, including a generally shared belief that our society has become far too polarized, the recognition that our students should be exposed to rational and civil presentations of competing ideas, and the belief that through this process, the abilities of our students to make sound judgments of their own about important policy issues will be enhanced. As a first step in launching this program, we surveyed the entire Pitt student body. We received about 1,400 responses, which we were told was very good. And the priority issues that those 14 students identified were democracy, racial equality, climate change, economic opportunity, the pandemic, and foreign policy and immigration. Our first program held last month, though, was not subject matter specific. Instead, we hosted two accomplished individuals who arrived at our program from very different places, with very different perspectives and occupying different positions on the political spectrum. Still, we now know from their conversation that they agreed on some important points. One is that at least until all of the evidence is in, people ought to try to keep an open mind. And the second is that people should look first for the common bonds that exist between them and others, rather than focusing first on differences which very often exacerbate the sense of division. The topic for today's program certainly provides opportunities for competing policy positions. And we are very fortunate that two of the country's leading minds have agreed to be with us to share their ideas with us and with each other. Our principal discussants are Darrick Hamilton, who is a university professor and the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School, and Scott Winship, who is a senior fellow and director of poverty studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researches social mobility and the causes and effects of poverty, and also focuses on economic insecurity and equality. To be clear, Dr. Hamilton and Dr. Winship have not been invited here tonight to engage in a debate. Instead, they are here to engage in a reasoned discussion about problems that they each would agree exist, but with respect to which they have different positions in terms of what would be the best policy solutions. We are very fortunate that they have agreed to participate. Tonight remotely, though, we've got big screen pictures of you guys, so it seems like you're right here in the room with us. And they each have expressed an interest in coming to campus at some future point in time. We also are very fortunate that Professor Kevin Kearns, who is a member of the faculty of our Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, is here in the room and has agreed to serve as our moderator. Among many, many other forms of special recognition that have been bestowed upon him, one is my favorite. That is, he is the winner of the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award here at Pitt. And I'm pleased to say that that award passed from my hands into his while I was still Chancellor. And far more recently, he also received the 2021 Leslie Whittington Excellence in Teaching Award from the Network of Schools of Public Policy, Affairs, and Administration. So he has received the highest teaching award, both from his home university and also from his discipline. I know that some of you have 6 o'clock classes, and I want to say that we're going to try to shift from the moderated discussion to questions and answers at about 5:50, so that may provide an opportunity for you to escape comparatively quietly. And when we do move into the question and answer session, there will be 2 members of the Institute of Politics team who will be here with microphones to move up and down the aisle. And if those microphones are like the one I'm using, they will do little to project in this room, but instead are hooked up so that the people to whom you will be addressing questions who are remote will be able to hear them. So let me again warmly welcome all of you as I turn the podium over to my very close and capable colleague, Professor Kevin Kearns. And again, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chancellor Nordenberg. It's really a pleasure to be with you tonight. I've been looking forward to this for weeks, and I'm just delighted to see all of you tonight. Both of our guests today are distinguished economists. I most assuredly am not a distinguished economist. And I would venture to say that many of you in this room are not economists either. In fact, with apologies to our guests, I would have to say that economics was well down the list of my favorite courses when I was a student. And if my professors were here tonight, I'm sure they could back me up in that statement. But in the long years since that time, I've learned that economics has a lot to say about many of the most pressing issues of our times. The cost of climate change, for example, to us and future generations. What do we need to invest in infrastructure so that we don't need to worry about bridges collapsing beneath us? And for our guests, that's an inside Pittsburgh joke because a bridge did collapse just a few weeks ago. And what's the value of a college education? Something many of you probably ponder every time you receive your tuition bill from Pitt, right? But our guests tonight are going to talk about a topic that transcends all of those. These 2 very accomplished economists are going to be speaking to us tonight about economic opportunity, and more specifically, how to provide equal access to economic opportunity for all of us, our friends, our neighbors, our classmates, and everyone in our community, our fellow citizens. Because it's the absence of this opportunity, it's the absence of equal access to opportunity that leads us into poverty. Now, the War on Poverty was a program of President Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s. It was an extensive and very coordinated effort by the federal government in concert with states and localities to give people access to affordable housing, food assistance, preschool education, job training, and many other essentials to escape the bonds of poverty. And I dare say that since that time, nearly every political candidate, from the president down to small town mayors, has proposed their own platform for providing opportunity for all of us. At the risk of oversimplifying, many of those programs are market-based. They propose market-based solutions, such as providing incentives for businesses to create more jobs, or adjustments to the tax code to help poor families. There's another side of those proposals that argues that market solutions alone are not enough, but rather that we need substantial investments by government in anti-poverty programs. Sadly, because of the polarized nature of our political discourse these days, our country is bitterly divided on many of these solutions, very bitterly. And also, I must say that it's somewhat disconcerting that since the 1960s, progress on poverty has been slow in some sectors and inconsistent. The needle hasn't moved as far as we would like. For example, the official poverty rate in 1964 hovered around 19%. Today, that official rate hovers around 14%. Progress, yes, but surely not as much as we would like, because 40 million of our fellow citizens live in poverty. And if we look at deep poverty, that is to say the people who earn less than 50% of the official poverty rate, it's around 4%. And these are the people who really, truly struggle on a daily basis to provide for themselves and the families the essentials of living: shelter, food, clothing. A complicating factor is that poverty can be a cyclical and intergenerational trap. Often the fault lines are long race, with people of color far more likely than whites to feel the effects of poverty. For example, Black families, the poverty rate is 18%. For Hispanics, 21.9%, and for whites, 9.6%. Now, both of our guests tonight recognize this problem and the very nature of it, and both are deeply committed on both a personal and professional level to finding solutions. As Chancellor Nordenberg said, they agree on some policies, they disagree on others, but most importantly, Doctors Hamilton and Winship come to us tonight committed to civil discourse and founded on mutual respect, active listening, empathy, and evidence-based solutions. So again, to be clear, simply to reiterate, tonight's discussion is not a debate. If you came here to witness a shouting match with winners and losers, you're going to be bitterly disappointed because both of our guests share the vision of the Institute of Politics to provide a forum where disparate ideas can be shared. So let's get started. Enough of me. Doctors Hamilton and Winship, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Each of you know that the country has made massive investments in equal opportunity in the years since the war on poverty. And I'm certain that both of you, having studied what you have, could recite chapter and verse the details of many of those policy initiatives. But I'd like to start at sort of the 10,000-foot level first, looking at the overall philosophy, the principles and assumptions of those programs. And I'm going to put just a straightforward question: what are we doing wrong in those programs? And also, what are we doing right? Dr. Winship, you've written a great deal on very technical details of many of these programs. Maybe we could start with you first.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be involved in such an important program as this. I think it's just a fantastic idea to try to get folks of differing perspectives in a room together and talk about issues in a calm way. And I'm really looking forward to sharing the virtual stage with Darrick tonight as well. So I guess I would start out by saying I hope you'll see I'm not somebody that's sort of triumphalist and is only going to tell you everything is fantastic and we don't have things that we need to worry about. That's absolutely not what I believe. But I do think that we should recognize that we're doing quite a bit right. So the official poverty rate has a number of flaws with it that are pretty well known among the folks that study this sort of thing. Other folks who people tend to think of as being either from the right or the left come to similar conclusions. So Bruce Meyer and Jim Sullivan, Bruce has an affiliation with AEI. They found the child poverty rate, for instance, fell from 20% in 1972 to 4% in 2018. There are some researchers at Columbia University who tend to sort of be on more progressive sides of these debates. Their numbers say that it fell from 20% in 1968 to about 10% in 2020. They've got figures that show that the poverty among single mothers and their families have fallen pretty dramatically as well. So I do think on poverty, we've actually made more progress than people realize. But at the same time, upward mobility out of poverty hasn't improved, and by some measures, it's gotten worse. And as we might talk about later, we've experienced all these social capital declines over the course of this period where poverty was falling, and so that ought to make us worry that we've been relatively successful reducing poverty, but at the same time, these other problems haven't gotten better or they've gotten worse. And I think the reason for that is that we could eliminate poverty tomorrow if we transferred enough money to people, right? You figure out how much money it would take to get every poor family above this arbitrary threshold that we call the poverty line. Give folks that amount of money, and that would poverty would disappear. But solving the other problems is harder, and it can actually be exacerbated if we simply just gave money to people to get them above the poverty line. Think about upward mobility, for instance. One way to solve the problem of poor kids not being able to escape poverty as adults is we could wait until they become adults and just give them money, right? Problem solved. But that's not satisfying because, if poor kids, if a lot of poor kids out there would like to be computer programmers or lawyers, doctors, what have you, but they, don't have the opportunities to do that for whatever reasons because of the educational system or challenges in their personal lives, then simply just giving them money to sort of top off their incomes, isn't a solution to that problem. Another solution would be we could give money to the parents of poor kids when they're kids, right? And that, to the extent I've got criticisms about what we're doing wrong, I would say, to sort of just give people money view is probably, I think, where people on the left tend to get things wrong. It might not be that giving more money to parents is going to improve the outcomes of kids. It might be that, a lot of the barriers to upward mobility are not economic. They're social, they're personal, they're all sorts of other challenges. And I think we really need to be careful about thinking that giving more money to folks is the answer. We also might incentivize people to behave in ways that actually impede their upward mobility, right? There was a big debate about the child tax credit last year. And a lot of conservatives, myself included to some extent, think that if you give cash to people without strings attached, then you're going to get more non-work, you're going to get more single parenthood, and that those are going to be bad for upward mobility in the long run. To the extent of criticisms of conservatives, what are conservatives doing wrong? I'd say one is there's this fatalism among conservatives that government can't do anything. Like we try a lot of government programs and they don't have the results we expect or that we wish they had. Therefore, we should do nothing. I think that's a profoundly fatalistic view and is a big problem on the right. And then the other view that I think is a problem on the right is that what we need to do is just get government out of the way, remove barriers. I'm somebody who think that's really important to remove barriers, whether that means welfare reforms or if it means occupational licensing, getting rid of some of those things. All that stuff's important, but we also shouldn't pretend, I think, that if we just got government out of the way, that somehow we would see these big jumps in upward mobility necessarily. So I guess that's how I would characterize what we're doing wrong.
Terrific, thank you, Dr. Hamilton. Your thoughts?
Well, I want to start with gratitude as well. Gratitude for this series, which I think is something that more universities should be doing. And gratitude to the Chancellor and yourself, as well as to Scott for joining me here today. So my answer to the question is that the problem is that we try to manage poverty rather than eliminate poverty. So Scott said it, we can eliminate poverty, and I agree with him. I think that poverty is an immoral blight. It's a political choice. I do think that it's more of a policy choice that we tolerate poverty rather than economic inevitability. So I wholeheartedly think that as a human right, people should not be poor. Now we can get into secondary questions of what is the impact on people's behavior if offered cash in a direct way? And I think there again, we have, in my view, a dogma about a grounding in what markets do and how markets function that goes unchallenged to the point that we never question what happens if you directly give people cash. The presumption is that it will lead to people being disincentivized from work. It will distort attitudes, norms, and behaviors that would be detrimental not only to society, but to the individuals to which cash is given. So the problem with me in that thinking is that it's a misunderstanding of how markets actually work in the first place from my standpoint. That if you enter a transaction with no resource, if you enter a transaction without any power, then you're at the whim of those that have power, or you're at the whim of charity. In other words, you have nothing by which you can bargain or negotiate with in a realistic way. That the threat of unemployment for somebody that goes to work without alternatives but to work in a job that offers poor conditions, low wages, becomes so paramount that they have no choice. It's not an authentic choice. Let me say a couple other things. I think some of the evidence from the experiments that are being conducted across the country of what happens when we offer people income without conditions are starting to demonstrate that not that they didn't reduce their work efforts, that actually it increased, that actually providing some resources so that people can do things that might not even be anticipated, like pay car fare to get on a bus to go to a job, like pay a babysitter so that they can actually go to a job, actually facilitated people to be able to reap the rewards for their effort or whatever ingenuity they have. And then the last point I want to make is that, we make decisions about giving people money all the time with the tax code. One thing that we should recognize, I know a lot of this conversation might be grounded in poverty, but with our tax code, one thing that is really clear is that we reward capital gains in a way that diverts federal resources much more than we reward labor. And if we look at our tax code, that demonstrates that. The ways in which we tax returns the capital that people earn for one segment of the population is very different than that in the ways we tax wages that people earn. I should say done, so we can go to the next.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Sorry about that. Thank you.
No, that was my mistake.
Well, when we think of anti-poverty programs, we often think of programs at the federal level. And yet there are also very interesting things going on at the state and local level. And Dr. Hamilton, you in particular, in an article last week in Bloomberg, you are known as, in effect, the kind of intellectual designer of something called baby bonds. And this is a program that once was viewed as sort of blue sky, and now it is actually taking root in places like Connecticut, District of Columbia, and the state of Washington. I wonder if you could tell us about baby bonds and how they may get to the issue of upward mobility that I know Dr. Winship is also very, very interested in.
Yeah, I am certain that Scott agrees with me that there are multiple dimensions of social mobility and human adequacy, that there is income, there's wealth, there's housing, et cetera. There is, we could keep going. So, the concept of income and wealth are not the same. And I think that both are important, but they do different things. In a nutshell, income is a periodic reward in exchange for something like labor, or in exchange for something like ownership in the form of rent. Whereas wealth is a stock. Wealth is a foundation. Wealth is essentially what you own versus what you owe. And then what they do for you is very different. So if you want to do something that is life-changing, wealth is perhaps a paramount indicator of financial well-being. If you want to send your child to an expensive university like the University of Pittsburgh, you're not going to finance that out of income, but rather wealth. If you're faced with a criminal justice system and you need a lawyer to defend you, you are not going to finance that out of income, but rather wealth. And I could keep going. If you want to leave your job as a university professor and become a cook, you need wealth to do so. So what baby bonds is intended to do is provide everybody with a birthright to capital. The ways in which most Americans generate wealth is not active savings, but passive savings. It's not taking income from their check and saving it per se, but rather it is being in a vehicle that will appreciate over their lifetime, like a home, like having a mortgage that provides automatic savings, like ownership in a business as opposed to being a worker, like having a job that provides them a retirement account. So the ways in which one gets into one of those ownership vehicles is capital itself. Basically, it is wealth that begets wealth. So I'll try to be not so long-winded because I know we want to have an exchange. But the essence of baby bonds is ensuring that everybody has a trust fund at birth, so that as a young adult, we have more than just subsistence programs, but something that can put you in an asset that will passively appreciate over your life.
Terrific. Dr. Winship, you've also looked at baby bonds to some extent. Would you have thoughts that you'd like to add to this?
I think there are elements of baby bonds that are really attractive. I think from a moral perspective, there's a lot to be said for the fact that we don't pick our parents, and kids are born into families and places that are not of their own choosing, born into advantages or disadvantages that aren't of anything that they're to blame for or that they can take credit for. And so I think it's important to have some element of investing in kids and not keeping that completely private. If we kept it completely private, you can imagine we wouldn't even have public schooling, right? So I think everybody on some level agrees with the idea that we shouldn't just let markets determine who's born to the right parents and then let the chips fall where they may after that. The baby bonds that I've proposed before and I have been a little bit different because they've not been unconditional. And a lot of people who propose baby bonds, do condition it. Either they sort of only allow the baby bonds to be used for certain purposes, for buying a home, for starting a business, paying for college. Those sorts of proposals, I think, have pretty well. I want to think they have pretty widespread support. They certainly have not gotten far in Congress, but there has been at least a little bit of bipartisan interest in that sort of thing, I think. When you start talking about unconditionally, then I think some of the costs of a baby bonds proposal, which are there regardless of whether there are conditions or not, but some of those costs start to worry me a little bit. And what are those costs? Well, depending on how generous the program is, it can be really expensive. I had a conversation with one of Darrick's co-authors in the past, William Darrick, about a proposal that he has, which actually might also be your proposal, Darrick. I know you guys do things together and things separately, but the proposal he has, which is for reparations, is on the order of just massive amounts of money. And he certainly believes that there are ways to fund that without hurting economic growth, for instance. I'm more skeptical of that. I think the cost of proposals matters a lot, especially when you have the kind of deficits that we've got post-COVID. And so that's probably the main objection that I would have. Also, I do think you need to worry at least a little bit about incentives, right? If everybody knew they were going to get a nest egg of some amount, regardless of what they did in high school, regardless of whether they went to college or, thought hard about where they wanted to be at 30. If you sort of take away some of the costs of what people do when they're younger, that can be bad. It can cause them to behave in ways we might not want. So I worry a little bit more about both of those. But the neat thing about baby bonds is it's a general approach that can be tailored to folks with different perspectives.
Right. Now, on this issue of the wealth gap, and I must admit that it was something I learned about only 8 or 9 years ago. And again, talking about it in terms of the kinds of things we think of as wealth, savings accounts, insurance policies, maybe a retirement account. Blacks have between 12 to 14% of the wealth that whites have invested in those types of assets. I'm going to tell a very brief personal story about wealth. This week, my family and I suffered the classic events in threes. We had a very expensive appliance breakdown, about $800. We had a gas line leak in our house that we weren't covered for, $2,300, that also left us fairly cold for 2 days without heat and hot water. And then we had a very expensive car repair that I just paid this morning, $700. Now, I'm not saying that didn't hit us hard, it did. But what I was struck by as I prepared for today's discussion was how hard that would hit a family without the kind of assets that we have, the savings account that has a little slack in it, the little rainy day fund that my wife is so good at keeping solid. And we are in a situation, I think it struck me as well, as why COVID hit poor communities so much harder than more affluent communities, because the wealth gap gives them not the resilience to sort of absorb those shocks. So maybe we could talk just a little bit briefly before we get on to the topic of social capital. How did we get to this state of affairs where there is such an extraordinary disparity in wealth between blacks and whites? Dr. Hamilton, maybe you could start on this one.
I mean, it begins with the inception of the nation when Black people were literally brought here as capital to facilitate a white landowning plantation class. It obviously didn't end with slavery. We have a long history of policies that were racist in their design and implementation. And I could say a whole lot more about that, from the Homestead Act to the GI Bill to restrictive covenants. I mean, we can get into a long history, but let me make clear that a white asset-based middle class never simply emerged. There were programs like FHA loans, like GI Bills, that, the GI Bill provided basically every male, 8 out of 10 males born in the 1920s had access to either a down payment for a home, a college education without debt, or finance or tuition, or some other piece of capital that facilitated their life. Now, although those bills didn't say Black people were not allowed to receive them, they were administered at local levels in Jim Crow context. They were, I could spend a whole lecture documenting this. So at the fear of taking up all our time, let me make the point that the racial wealth gap is grounded in a history where government policy has facilitated the asset accumulation and the intergenerational transmission of wealth for one group of people and not another. And then let me also say, in the cases when Black people were able to amass wealth, it never had the political codification to be protected from theft, fraud, and outright terror. So there are histories in communities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Tulsa Race Massacre where modicums of wealth that was established was literally decimated by terrorist mobs. There is a long history of Black farmers accumulating land, and that land being literally defrauded of those Black farmers with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in cahoots with local farmers of taking that land. So that is our history. And then that explains why generally, for the most part in American history, a typical Black family has about a dime for every dollar in wealth as a typical white family. If we look at the mean, the difference is far more dramatic, but that has to do with a white billionaire class, a predominantly white billionaire class that affects the wealth distribution for all Americans, Black or white. And then, one quick distinction between what I think was referenced as a reparations program and baby bonds is that reparations and baby bonds aren't the same. They're complements, but they aren't the same. And I believe both are necessary, but they are not the same. Reparations is intended to redress that long history that I've been describing, whereas baby bonds is a forward-looking birthright to capital for everyone, Black or white, but it has anti-racist effects given how large this wealth distribution that we're talking about today is. And, in fact, if we look at progress in race between Blacks and whites, there's been dramatic progress from about 1945 to about the mid-1970s in many dimensions. After about the mid-70s, that progress ceased and it plateaued. But in the dimension of wealth, it has never been the case that there's been any substantive Black middle class when it comes to wealth. So that racial wealth gap is pretty much as large as it's been since the period of antebellum United States history, right after slavery, from when Blacks were literally capital assets for a white landowning plantation class. And one last point, this gets at perhaps the root of the conversation from my perspective. Thinking about property rights as opposed to human rights in an ahistoric manner. So if we have a government and a society that's keenly focused on protecting the property rights of people without any accounting of that immoral past that has led to the racialized differences in power that exist today and the class-based differences in power that exist today, to me, that's an immoral society. To me, that is not an honest society. Alternatively, what I'm trying to propose is an inclusive economic rights society that says whether you're a capitalist, socialist, who cares? Actually, I do care a little, but the real relevant point is empowering people with the necessary resources and certain enabling goods and services like a job, like some income, like a right to healthcare, like a right to capital that allows them to ultimately reap the rewards of their ingenuity, to reap the rewards of their effort and not be at the whim of charity or exploitation.
Thank you. I want to turn to some questions from our audience in just a few minutes, but before doing so, I want to turn to a topic that both of you have written extensively on. Dr. Winship, you were involved in an extensive project on this, and that's the idea of social capital. It's related to wealth, but it's somewhat different. Social capital is the idea simplistically defined as a network of resources, people, institutions, family ties, clubs, alumni associations, volunteer groups, congregations, intangible resources that can facilitate upward mobility. And it could be argued, again, I'm not an economist, but that social capital in some instances is just as important to upward mobility or accompanies wealth transfer as a way of upward mobility. Another personal story, my parents, for example, left my siblings and me with absolutely no transferable wealth per se, but they created for us a vast reservoir of social capital that we could draw upon. So Dr. Winship, let me just turn to you. You've written a lot on this. You've thought a lot about it. You've been part of a federal project in this regard. Some people say that social capital is shrinking for all of us, perhaps communities of color in particular. What can we do to increase social capital and leverage it for upward mobility?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like each of these questions could be the basis of, of a whole hour-long discussion. So I think you're absolutely right that social capital is incredibly important to upward mobility, and I think in a lot of ways it makes the most sense to think about social capital as a form of wealth. Other forms of capital, financial capital, human capital, physical capital. These are all things that, like Darrick said, it's a stock. Wealth is a stock of stuff that is productive for people, whatever your ends are, right? If you've got if you've got some property that you own and it gives you a flow of money, you can use that money for whatever your ends are. If you are rich in social capital, if your networks, you have lots of friends and family members who support you, that's productive for you, whatever it is that you want to do in life, right? You have access to these resources. And I would agree that social capital is on the decline in a pretty pervasive way. Conservatives talk a lot about family structure, which I think is really important, and which is definitely related to wealth inequality as well. But I think in some ways it makes sense to think about family decline and family instability as being part of a broader trend of relationships being weaker than they used to be. We do less with our neighbors than we used to do. We attend church less frequently than we used to do. We have much less trust in institutions than we used to have. Even things like, spending time after work with coworkers, we found on this project that I was working on, that's declined quite a bit over time. So pretty much across the board, we do less with each other and our relationships are weaker. And that's been harmful to everybody. What can you do about it? This is an area where it can be tricky to think about what government's role is in these things, especially if you're talking about the federal government. If you think about marriage and single parenthood, for instance, there are things we can do at the margins. I think the anti-poverty policies of the 1990s, which combined welfare reforms that made it more difficult to receive cash benefits without working, but at the same time also were more generous to people who did work in terms of the assistance that they got. Those have the potential, I think, to affect single parenthood at the margin. You can sort of squint at some charts in the rate at which women gave birth without being married. And that got worse for decades and decades and then stopped getting worse around the time of welfare reform. Hasn't gotten all that better. The last decade or so, things have turned around a little bit. But it's possible that the welfare reforms of the 90s were behind that. You can imagine other policies like changing our tax credits that we give to working families so that they don't penalize marriage as much as they do. If couples earn more money, then the amount they can get in these tax credits can go down, and that can act as a barrier for couples to get together and become married rather than living separately or cohabiting and each sort of getting these tax credits. There are marriage promotion programs that haven't really been all that successful, but I gather there are some examples in the last 5 or 6 years that seem to be moving the needle. In other areas, I think, neighborhood environments are incredibly important. I think when we talk about Black-white inequality in particular, that's just a huge dimension of inequality. There's a great paper by Pat Sharkey from probably 10 or 15 years ago at this point, but essentially he showed that among kids born in the early 1960s, white kids grew up in neighborhood poverty that was only experienced by about 6% of them, but it was experienced by about 2/3 of Black kids. We got those results and we asked him to sort of redo them for more recent birth cohorts. So he looked at kids born in the early 1980s and essentially found nothing had changed. So African-American kids grow up in concentrated poverty to a much greater extent than white kids do. What can we do about that? If we think neighborhood context is important, which it surely must be, we can do things like encourage moves to opportunity. There's a program that Raj Chetty, who's a Harvard economist, is pushing where you advise families that, hey, if you move to these neighborhoods over here, they've been shown to actually promote upward mobility statistically in the data. And they work with landlords to try to get the landlords more receptive to taking families that have these housing vouchers. I think that's a really neat program. You can do things like have zoning reforms and land use reforms, places like San Francisco, where they've priced lower income people out of not just neighborhoods, but entire cities in some ways. We've got to make it easier for families to be able to move to opportunity. And then you can turn to things like networking. One of the costs of being born into a poor family is that your networks to people who have experienced professional success and can navigate the system, are weaker and sparer. And so, there are programs like Urban Alliance here in DC and a few other cities, that try to match kids up with mentors and internships where you can help extend some of the networks that these kids have. So those are just a few ideas.
Terrific. I want to follow up quickly, but before I do that, we need to pause for just a moment. For those of you who have a 6 o'clock class, now is probably a good time to gather your things and make your way across campus. We thank you for being here with us and good luck in your evening class. So thank you very much for being here. My quick follow-up to this, as some of our students are leaving, and as I watch them leave, I'm reminded that some people are saying that this generation, the generation sitting in front of us tonight, will be the first generation that will not be as upwardly mobile as their parents. Now, first of all, is that true? I've heard it. I don't know if it's exactly true, but is it too late to address that issue? And Dr. Hamilton, maybe I'd ask you to perhaps address that. And maybe also if you'd like to respond to the things that Dr. Winship said a moment ago, and then I'm going to stop and turn it over to our audience for questions.
I mean, if we do nothing, the answer is yes. But to me, the bigger point is that as we have been talking, these are political choices. So the answer to whether they can be as upwardly mobile of as their parents or even exceed the mobility rates of their parents, that's a political choice. There are things we can do about that. There are things we can replicate that led to the mobility of their parents that can be replicated for them. The reality is this current generation came of age during the Great Depression, and they were told to go to college and wait out the Depression and better themselves. And during that time, they accumulated record levels of student debt. Well, it's a political choice that we bestowed upon them record levels of student debt. The Great Recession perhaps was going to happen. Then coming out of that, now they're faced with a double scarring that's going to result from this pandemic recession, which, I applaud the government's response because it was different than that of the Great Recession. So it's going to mitigate some of the damage. But nonetheless, the larger point is there's social programs that we can enact that could change the reality. But go back and answer some of the previous questions. I'll say it's a thin line between social capital and nepotism. And then I'll go a step further and say nepotism is analogous with positive discrimination. So I think we should keep that in mind. Obviously, there's benefit associated with human beings that offer mentorship, but the ways in which our country has bestowed social capital has often been done in a discriminatory way. And we should, we haven't talked about that a lot in our conversation, but discrimination is a reality also in our country. The other part about family structure, I think the emphasis is wrong. The directional emphasis is wrong. We presume that family structure is an input into the output of economic conditions, but the reverse is just as true. Perhaps the issue is family structure itself is the result of some families or some individuals being better resourced as opposed to the others. We know that why families break up is often related to economic conditions. We can look within Black households and we can see that incarcerating 1 out of 3 young Black men is certainly going to lead to some family disruptions. there's a woman, Diane Stewart, who has a book entitled Black Women, Black Love, America's War on Black Marriages. I think that's a great title, and I think it's a great book. She's a religiosity scholar who is making the point in her thesis that love itself is something that we should be promoting as a society, and that our society as currently structured denies pathways for love to people because we under-resource groups of people. And I think that's an incredible thesis. I think that, our notions of what a good economy is needs to be expanded. Ultimately, what we should care about is human flourishing. And this is not pie in the sky. And I'll offer a point of chastising to you and say that I don't like the statement, I'm not an economist. There certainly is great expertise that economists bring to this conversation, but economists should not be solely deciding how distribution is allocated and the mechanisms by which decisions are made in our society. And I think it's a problem that we abdicate our responsibilities and presume that economists have a scientific, technical know-how that's devoid of politics and values. There are a lot of great things that economists offer. We are really good at measuring things and estimating things. But the choice of what we value as a society should not be left to our domain. We get to choose. We get to choose what a good functioning economy is. And in fact, anytime people make decisions, the notion that they're simply price takers in exchange, that's a fallacy. It's never been that case. Markets themselves are the result of political codifications. Whenever somebody enters an exchange, it is never solely them acting with their unfettered choice with other agents to lead to some outcome. So we have a devoid notion of power if we simply rely on markets as the fair, efficient allocation of goods and services.
Terrific.
Can I say a couple things, Kevin? Sure. So just a couple quick things, just because I think part of the point of these conversations is to sort of, clarify where there are kind of disagreements in perspective that are sort of underlying some of the different positions that folks come to. And I think one of the ones that are coming through in this conversation is, I would repeat, from my perspective, I think a lot of times we put too much of an emphasis on economic causes of our problems. So to say, it's certainly the case that poverty, makes marriages harder, right? It makes people less attractive as potential marriage partners, for sure. So you would expect more poverty, that you would get more single parenthood, perhaps. Although more poverty also means that it's harder to live without a second potential earner in the family as well. But at any rate, I think the trends, just don't match up with the story that this is sort of all about economics. Among African Americans in 1960, about 20% of births were to unmarried mothers. By 2018, that was 70%. African American men and certainly African American women make more today than they did in 1960 by quite a bit. And if you don't find that compelling, I would say among whites, 2% of births were to unmarried mothers in 1960. In 2018, that's up to 28%. White men and white women are doing better than they were in 1960 by just about any metric. So at the same time that we had all this improvement in living standards, we got these declines in social capital. Again, not just in sort of family stability, but in all these other parts of our social lives. So I do think that would be sort of one place where I would highlight, I guess, a distinction between Darrick's premises and mine. The other would be, we keep hearing Darrick is sort of saying, like, we know how to do this. This is a political choice. I think that's also a perspective that I think that I just would disagree with. Not that we aren't making political choices, but we don't necessarily know how to do this, right? I think there's an idea underlying that perspective, which is we could just set the right policies, give people more money, give people nest eggs, give people baby bonds, And that would result in more marriage. That would result in more stable families. That would result in more upward mobility. And I don't think we know that. I don't think the history of American policy, especially at the federal level, gives us much reason to believe that's the case. Even though I completely agree with Darrick about, how did we get here? Being the result of, hundreds of years of discrimination against African Americans, state sanctioned in many regards. An apartheid state in a large part of the country up until just a little over a generation ago. But the sort of what do you do with that, I think is a lot more complicated, because I think there are costs, and I think we don't actually know what the right policies are to do some of that.
Thank you both very much. I'd very much like to take some questions from our audience. Now, we have several people with microphones who are prepared to walk around, and let's hear what you have to say and what you'd like to address. We have a couple up here in the upper echelons there. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. This has been fascinating. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Can you hear? Okay.
Can you hear? Okay. One of the things that I'm really interested in, I'm actually doing a lot of research on it for a course right now. So it was like the first thing to come to mind is actually the role in investment in public transportation as a means of promoting equity, especially in urban areas. I'm sure both of you are familiar with the Harvard study published in 2017, finding that access to reliable public transit is the single leading indicator of one's ability to escape poverty. So I am curious, well, one, why there isn't more bipartisan support for it, because, in both of your views, one, because in addition to promoting social and economic mobility, it also leads to economic development in the places where transit is invested in, as well as reduces green carbon emissions, and it promotes job growth, access to jobs, access to healthcare. I mean, it really has so many benefits. I'm curious if you guys see, especially in the context of urban areas, and the majority of America lives in or around a city, if you see public transit as kind of a key part of this picture of promoting or of reducing poverty, and if so, I think, like, what are the key ways to get bipartisan support for investment in public transit?
Great question. Either one of you would like to take the lead on that?
So for one, I'm not familiar with that study, and I'm not any kind of an expert on transportation policy. I think there are a couple different issues in the background there, right? One is affordability, and there I'm a big believer that rather than subsidizing certain things and not other things, public transit but not cars, rather than do that, the thing to do is to give people money and let them make their own choices. But you're talking about more than just sort of affordability, right? You're talking about transforming the geography of opportunity and economic development for entire cities. Without knowing the study that you're talking about, one thing that I sort of always like to try to warn undergraduates and grad students too, if some of you are grad students, there are studies that sort of show everything. You could find a study to sort of say like X causes Y, and then you can find another study to say that X doesn't cause Y. And I think you have to be very careful about relying on sort of one study. If there were really kind of a magic bullet, then it's likely that at least some mayor would have figured it out, some governor, some president, some Congress. So I guess I'm a little bit skeptical that if that we could sort of have as dramatic an effect on upward mobility just by investing more in public transit as it sounds like that paper suggests. The other thing is that in the real world, it's incredibly expensive and inefficient to do public transit. The cost of like extending or repairing the subway in New York City is just a monstrosity. There's sort of money ends up going to the unions, money ends up going to this developer, to that developer. Before you know it, you're 20 years out and overrun by several billions of dollars, and still don't have your subway.
So I agree that there is no silver bullet policy, but that doesn't mean it's a bad policy. I agree that the notion of causality should be considered. It could be places that have good public transportation are also places that have other good public infrastructure that facilitates mobility and economic activity. But that said, I think public transit is an important public infrastructure to allow for mobility in a way that is probably more efficient than privately allowing people to go into a car, especially in congested areas. But then I also want to say something else about mobility. And that is, we've been talking a lot about race. And another thing that we should consider is that Black people in the United States do not have free mobility across society without the threat of bodily harm or detention at the hands of state-sanctioned police. That's a reality. And there's been ample evidence that's been in existence for the last couple of years, but also throughout history. So our concept of mobility should also incorporate some of the politics around the ways in which we police communities. I would want to expand the conversation in ways in which we think about economic activity to and understand that reality as well.
Thank you. We have another question up here, I believe.
Hi. Sorry, it's like a little weird talking to a microphone and not hear anything. But thank you both for coming here. It's really exciting to hear the different perspectives. And I kind of wanted to call back to something we talked about pretty early on. We were talking about baby bonds. To me, at least, it sounded like both of you had like very similar viewpoints. Actually, it sounded like you guys kind of agreed, but I think something that Scott said was he was more hesitant about unrestricted baby bonds or like unconditional baby bonds versus I think what Darrick said, which was more just about baby bonds in general. So I was hoping you guys could maybe go more into depth about your viewpoints on like the specifics of how you think that policy should work. Like, should it just be like a conditional sort of people like have to spend it on a certain thing once they are able to access those funds, or is it just like, or do you think it should just be something where you get the trust fund and it's your social, it's the capital that you receive for basically being born into the country?
Should I go first, Scott, on this?
Sure, of course.
So, one of the best articles written about baby bonds was by a friend of mine, and it was called Baby Bonds, an Idea a Conservative Should Love. And why do I say it's the best? Because because it was a political jargon the way it was written. That's why. And it's probably not the best. But here's the point. There is a restrictiveness in the baby bonds concept that I'm offering, and that is that it's restricted towards some asset enhancing endeavor, like a home, like a debt-free college education, some seed capital to start a business, or a retirement account. And the reason why I'd restrict it in that way is not to be paternalistic, but to recognize that wealth and income are different. I think I differ from Scott in that I'm in favor of guaranteed income as well. I'm in favor of a refundable child tax credit as well. But for different reasons than I'm in favor of baby bonds. So the restrictive nature of baby bonds is to avoid policy creep so that it is keenly focused on the purpose of the policy, which is the wealth dimension of inequality and economic empowerment. And the last thing, just to get clarity on the concept, these accounts are seeded to everyone at birth, but they're seeded in a progressive manner so that if you're born into the most wealth-poor family, you will receive the largest endowment. If you're born into the wealthiest family, to promote a stakeholder society similar to Social Security, you also would receive a stake in the society. And then again, it's counterintuitive because most of the US policy that we have focuses on family development when we talk about children. This, in a lot of ways, divorces people from the family context in which they're born. It says irrespective of the family that you're born in, it's not completely irrespective, it's the family economic circumstances, but it says that you will receive a set aside resource when you become a young adult that's for you, that your family itself can't address, they can save if they want, but this is reserved for you. It not only has race effects of promoting race equity, gender equity. You can imagine within households, some families bequest more for their male offspring than they do their female offspring. So in some ways, this is saying that the government will reserve this for you as a birthright, and in a way that could divorce you in some ways from the family that you're born into.
So yeah, I think the specific proposal that I had was was pretty weird. I think some of my colleagues at AEI even thought it was a little weird. I was proposing it. Well, so first I want to say I remembered the other thing that I don't necessarily love about some of the more expansive baby bond proposals, in addition to the cost, is the universality of it, and that's related to the cost, right? That's why I don't like the universality of it. If you make programs universal, they're just a lot more expensive than if you target them on sort of people who are more in need, who face more disadvantages, et cetera. So the proposal that I had was actually an alternative to the expansion of the child tax credit last year. I and some others objected to this expansion because it would have removed a phase-in, basically a work incentive for lower income families. Essentially, you get a bigger child tax credit the more that you work up to a certain point, and so it encourages employment. The expansion last year did away with that phase-in, and you got the same amount whether you worked 0 hours or whether you worked full time. And so I and others worried that it was going to reduce work. There were some good studies predicting that it would have reduced work by 1.5 million people. So I was trying to be productive and not just say like no, but to propose something that I thought would actually both reduce child poverty and promote upward mobility in a way that didn't have these potential unintended consequences. And it was a baby bonds proposal, essentially to replace the part of the child tax credit that people would have got under Biden's plan, but that now has gone away. And so rather than getting, year after year, this extra child tax credit, an amount would have gone into these baby bond accounts for kids. Then when they turned 18, they could use them towards certain ends, similar to what Darrick said. But I had an added twist in mind, which was that you had to first demonstrate some amount of work history. You had to spend a certain amount of time either childless or married, in order to sort of encourage people to delay their first births until they're married. And it also had a requirement about graduating from high school as well. So it's tended to promote these three behaviors that are empirically linked. I wouldn't go so far as to say the causal link has been, confirmed. Intuitively, it makes sense, that if you finish high school, if you have a work history behind you, and if you delay having kids until you're older and married, that those are upward mobility promoting. So mine was, for more libertarian conservatives, who don't want the federal government to sort of pick sides at all on any of this stuff. Even some of my colleagues that are like, well, that feels too paternalistic to me. And, I think I'm sort of guilty as charged in some sense of wanting to use social policy to encourage certain ends.
We have a few more questions. I want to get to as many as we possibly can. And where are we now? Oh, I'm so sorry. Excuse me.
So I just wanted to say first, my head is spinning right now. There's so many amazing ideas and topics that are being discussed today, and I can't wait to go back and tell my public health of equity professor all about it. She's going to love this. And I also wanted to bring in the discussion more of education and how that's a really big issue, is funding in education in districts and how even in cities, having that access to education and the resources, just as you both were saying, people are born into families. This is not a choice of where we're born, who we're born to, or the circumstances that we are born in. And I think that it's very important to just give as much opportunity to children, not even with, I understand the baby bonds. There's something else I sparked up from that, but I'll leave that to maybe an email later. And I've been doing some research and discussion in multiple of my classes on the importance of education and how that affects not only equality, because we can't really say that we can give equal opportunity, because when children are already born to these different circumstances, it's already unequal. It's already unfair because of, like you both were saying, with nepotism and the sociodynamics of a family system and encouragement. And I was just wondering what both of your viewpoints and ideas were based on expanding educational opportunity within these poverty areas and giving those kids that hope to then move on to better circumstances. Because we all in this room, we all have different stories and we all have different perspectives. And some of us might have two parents, some might have one, some may have felt like they didn't really have any. And I know for a fact the importance of teachers and the educational system within my own life, and how teachers were a really big part of encouraging me and helping me feel like I could be more than what maybe if they weren't there, maybe my own set of values or society has set up for myself. And so I was just wondering what you guys thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think educational inequality, I think, is profoundly important. And one thing we haven't talked as much about as I'd sort of intended to during this talk is kind of the importance of early childhood inequalities. There's this really interesting. So again, I want to reiterate that I thought Darrick articulated the sort of how did we get here question. His answer to that was far better than I could have said. Where we might diverge a little bit is sort of on the importance of sort of ongoing discrimination, systemic racism, is sort of a word that's come into use the last couple of years, which I don't sort of have strong thoughts about that. What I will say is that if you sort of subject anybody, any group of people to 300 years of discrimination, then the idea that like everybody's at the same starting line now, once sort of formal state-sanctioned discrimination goes away, is ludicrous, right? It sort of creates conditions, it creates neighborhood residential patterns, economic segregation, it creates differences in school quality, it creates differences in sort of the skills that parents have when their kids arrive. These are all things that if we somehow manage to get rid of discrimination tomorrow, would continue to be major barriers to upward mobility that would disproportionately affect African American kids. And I think one of the most important facts to contend with is that there are just these very large inequalities in school readiness when kids start kindergarten. That's true both in terms of class. So in class, if you look at kids in the sort of top fifth of parental advantage in terms of education and income, compare them to kids who are in the bottom fifth of educational and income advantage. The test score, the average test score difference between them and things like reading and math at the start of kindergarten are the equivalent of like 18 IQ points. I'm not bringing IQ in to bring in IQ. Sort of people are familiar with kind of an IQ scale. So it's 1.2 standard deviations, which on an IQ test is about 18 points. So those are vast. The black-white differences actually are smaller than those differences between the top fifth and the bottom fifth in terms of class, but they're still big. They're still on the order of 7 to 10 points on sort of an IQ scale. And if kids are starting school with those sort of disparities, we ought to expect the K through 12 education system to narrow them. But on the other hand, you know, we probably ought to be taking a look at those sorts of disparities before kids get to school. And so that's why I think we need to actually invest a whole lot more in trying to figure out more early childhood interventions that are effective, which, you know, is sort of a longer conversation. There's some really intensive models that seem to have worked pretty well from the 1960s. Sort of more scaled up programs that you tend to find today, public pre-K or Head Start, don't offer as much reason to be hopeful, but it's certainly incredibly important from my perspective.
Dr. Hamilton.
Black people actually overachieve in education. If you control for income, Black people are more likely to graduate from college than white people. If you look at enrollment in graduate school, Black people are over-enrolled in a proportional sense in graduate school than white people. In fact, that might be a resume building effect. They may recognize that society still treats them differently than they do white people, so they choose to over-enroll to try to overcome the discrimination that they expect they're going to find. Let me say a couple of other things. We exaggerate the functional role of education to the detriment of understanding the functional roles of wealth and power. If you look at the economic returns to an education for a Black person versus a white person, we know that disparities exist at every level of education, but they get larger at higher levels of education. So I can tell you that the typical Black family with the head having a college degree has generally less wealth than a white family where the head dropped out of high school. Or if I tell you that the mortality rate difference between a Black person and a white person between the ages of 25 and 65 is about 50%, but that disparity rises to 70% if we look at those with a college degree, it should suggest to you that education is not the panacea to redress socially established structural barriers. Within group, there is no question that education leads to better outcomes, but across groups, it does not. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go to college. That doesn't mean a Black person shouldn't go to college. To me, education in and of itself is important enough. Aside from the functional role, the privilege that you all have to be in that social setting, to get trained by people to teach you to synthesize information into big ideas is worthy enough. And this goes back to, we get to decide what kind of economy we want. And if we value people being able to critically think, that in and of itself is important enough. So I'm going to end with two last points. One is, the word opportunity to me has become a political ruse. I've exercised it from my vocabulary. Not that opportunity in and of itself is a bad word, but it's a political tool that has been used to say, if we provide opportunity for people and they don't achieve, it's on them. I think it's been used as a mechanism to absolve the public of social responsibility and to focus everything in education reform as the means of social mobility. Every president since Nixon has advocated two things for Black mobility: education investments and investment in entrepreneurship, and not offered all the other things that we can talk about that can improve Black as well as white economic well-being. So to me, again, I've been emphasizing directional emphasis simply because you observe people with high levels of education also having high levels of economic circumstance does not mean that that was a causal relationship. Umbrellas don't make it rain. If you see people with umbrellas and it's raining, the umbrellas didn't cause the rain. So I caution us to think about causality and also thinking about some of the statistics that are lived. And the last point is that the conservative rhetoric that hard work and effort can have detrimental effects as well. Remember, I cited to you that statistic that the mortality difference between a Black person with a college degree is 70% higher than that of a white person with a college degree. When I tell you that a Black man with a college degree is 3 times more likely to die from a stroke than a white man who dropped out of high school, or a Black woman with a college degree is more likely to have an infant death than a white woman who dropped out of high school, you very well might, to me, there's evidence to suggest that all that effort, all that grit that's put forth, what we don't ask when we tell people to work twice as hard to get by, to overcome your circumstance, we don't ask at what cost? At what cost does it bear on you to be above average? Everybody can't be above average. So I dare say that some of the disparities that we see in mortality rates and other stress and stigma is related to some of the effort that puts all that responsibility on individuals that don't redress some of the structural barriers that they face in overcoming their circumstances to achieve economic outcomes.
I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else. Let's get one more question in and let's keep it brief if we can. Somebody here has the mic.
Can you guys hear me all right? So I am completely inclined to agree with you, Dr. Hamilton. And I think you said that so eloquently and beautifully. So my question is kind of twofold. I totally agree that just speaking about opportunity is not sufficient. And like, I also agree with the previous question that education is important, but I think that the way we talk about education isn't enough. We just see as access to education as opportunity, like you mentioned, kind of vague and not understanding what the curriculum is. I think a lot of us have access to public education, but that education is very bad, in my opinion. I'm from Miami and I went to public school, and I'm the daughter of immigrants. And I think I made it here both because of my parents' like education and that privilege, and them reminding me that education is important, but not so much because of the education I received in the public school system. So one thing I want to mention, the first question is education in terms of curriculum, like financial literacy, is not taught in America. And I don't know how to pay my taxes, and that's important to be a good citizen, right? Like no one is taught how to pay their taxes. No one is taught how to open an IRA. Like I have an IRA because my brother told me about it and I found that out, and I'm a grad student. And like, no one talks to you about that. No one tells you how to have passive income. No one tells you to acquire capital. No one tells you to have assets. Like this is not taught in America. So the whole American dream of pick yourself up by your bootstrap, it's mythology. It's not true because we're not taught how to succeed in America. So I think my first question is, how can we address the curriculum in education to accommodate for this kind of upward mobility and economic success from the early stages of education? And then also moving forward, once you do reach that point of young adulthood and you kind of reach the 18 mark, what is your guys' opinion in terms of UBI, universal basic income, as an option in which you're getting paid to learn how to be financially literate, right? You're not just being given money free for just being a person in America, but because you are learning how to use that money appropriately, or not appropriately, but knowing how to utilize your money in a way that is efficient and productive and sustainable overall.
Complex question, and doesn't lend itself to a quick answer, but what do both of you have to say about that?
And I can take that cue in that you want us to be quick, so I'm going to try to be quick and say that, I'd use the word financial coaching. The wealthiest amongst us often don't make decisions about their financial portfolio, but they have financial advisors and financial coaches. So I'm for financial coaching, and we want to say education literacy. I'm all for it. That's all great. But the critical ingredient is finance itself. All the financial literacy in the world is irrelevant if you have no finances to manage in the first place, and in fact could be cruel to some extent. So I'm for that. On the question of UBI, I'm for guaranteed income, and here's where Scott and I probably agree. I'm not for the universality of basic income because I think it's the definition of inflation to literally give everybody the same amount. All that does is inflate the economy by that amount. And it's also inequality enhancing. If you give a wealthy person income, they will save it, invest it, because a smaller share of their income goes towards consumption almost by definition. And then we need curricular reform in education, period. We need to give everybody access to a talented and gifted curriculum. And there's historical reasons as to why that's not the case today.
I'll try to be quick as well. I think your question is really interesting. I think it touches on an interesting tension that I guess is a good place for me to sort of leave on. The first part was you saying that this universal government provided system failed you, right? That your public school didn't help you that much, that it was only because of your parents that you got to where you are. So this universal government provided system failed us, but we need someone to come and teach everybody financial literacy, presumably the government, or we need a universal basic income from the government. There is an issue, I think, that conservatives probably think too much about, but that maybe liberals don't think enough about, which is just what are the practical limits to what government can do when there are disparities in the world. I think government should absolutely be promoting opportunity, promoting upward mobility for kids. I think there's an affirmative role for government to do that. But I also think that there are limits to what government can do. Setting up a K through 12 education system that every child in the country gets is an incredibly ambitious policy. And given how ambitious that is and the challenges that kids bring to classrooms, public education is probably doing a decent job. I think we can do a lot better. There are reforms we can do, but that should sort of be in the back of your head a little bit. I think whenever you think about we need a universal public program to accomplish X. Think of your least favorite public institution, and maybe that's better than no public institution at all. Or maybe there are ways to incentivize private people to take care of that. And if there are, there's a role for policy in doing that. But I think lots of times the answers are just much more complicated than we wish, than I wish.
Well, let me close by thanking Doctors Harrington, Winship, and Kearns for a great program. And I'm not sure how applause will work over this remote sound system. We really are grateful to the two of you for being with us tonight and speaking to the students. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll come back. We're going to restart our programming during the month of September next fall. The first program, in fact, will be September the 22nd. It will feature Arthur Brooks, who is a former president of the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Winship's current home. He currently is the William Henry Bloomberg Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School. Among his many books are some with titles as thought-provoking as Love Your Enemies, The Conservative Heart, and Who Really Cares. A very recent article was featured on the cover of the March issue of the Atlantic. Its theme is that the way to find happiness is to learn to want less. So he will be here on September the 22nd. You might want to mark that date. Also, we've had infrastructure mentioned by a number of people a number of times this evening. You may have seen from the flyer on the table when you arrived that on the evening of April the 12th, the Thornburg Forum for Law and Public Policy will be presenting a remote lecture by Congressman Mike Doyle on infrastructure. And many of us think that a lot of attention has been paid to the dollar size of the infrastructure legislation that passed. and not enough attention has been paid to what difference it actually is going to make in the lives of people, whether it is bridges, as Professor Kearns indicated earlier, or Congressman Doyle is the chair of the House Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, and will be in a particularly good position to talk about what this bill's intended impacts are with respect to issues of broadband and the inequality of access that exists in rural areas and in urban areas. So again, Congressman Doyle's program will be the evening of April the 12th. Don't forget, there is food. You can grab and go if you must. On the other hand, we also deliberately have tried to generate audiences that reflect a wide range of disciplines and schools and levels of where you are in your educational journeys and campuses and countries. So if you've got the time, you might find it's worthwhile to get to know some of the other students who are here too. So thanks again to our distinguished trio of doctors. And thanks to all of you for being here. I hope you have a great night and great rest of the term. Thanks again.
Darrick,
Thanks, everybody.
Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Greatly
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you.
it.
It was fun.
Thank you. Thank you very much.